Good morning. Welcome to The Human Author. This is episode 7. My name is Jen Cantwell, otherwise known as JB Cantwell. And today I'm working on the 5th book in my Light Chaser series, which is called The Warning. If you want to learn more about this series, you can check out my website at jbcantwell.com. And there's a bunch of information there about the series that I'm working on. One reminder from every day, if you don't have time to stick around for the full hour, you're free to come here for the first 10 or 15 minutes and listen to what I did the day before. So without any further ado, I'm going to start reading, and then I will get moving on the rest of chapter 4. Still, as I made my way through the forest, I looked for others I might know, other manifestations of my mind. It didn't matter to me then if they were real or conjured or in my imagination. I had known my mother once, even if it had only been for a few moments. So where was she? Why wasn't she here if everyone else was too? Mother, I called out into the trees. Mother! Nothing happened. No one appeared. I tried something different. Alina! Hoping beyond hope that I would hear an answer. But I knew that one couldn't necessarily control the visions she might have. Whatever this forest was, it seemed to have a mind of its own. For several days, I was wandering aimlessly through the trees, occasionally trying to call out to those I knew who could give me counsel. Connell, Kara, and yes, of course, my mother. On my 4th day, I thought about the song grandmother had sung. Had that really been true? I hadn't actually been here. Where did I learn the tune? Was it lost? Was it some lost memory lodged in my mind from those first few moments of my life? I stumbled over a tree branch, nearly falling to the forest floor. But it was this action that made me realize I was getting toward the end. When I put my hands down upon the earth, I felt not underbrush, but rock. Something different. I perked up, suddenly excited. I couldn't wait to get moving somewhere that I could see the sun to put me in the right direction. It didn't take me very long to get out of the trees, but when I finally did, I was greeted with quite a view. In the distance, I could see a city, and the red wildlands that stretched from the city southward sealed my belief. I was almost home. Well, maybe not almost. There was an enormous mountain range between me and that dangerous place. As I looked over the scene, I wondered if grandmother's words had been right. I took in the mountain range, looking for ways I could climb down and then up the other side again, alone in the mountains before, and they had been so dark. These seemed ordinary by comparison. I took out my map, but I didn't need to look for this place upon it, for I already knew where I was. These were the soaring mountains where Connell had lost a brutal fight against Torrin's son, Phelan. His powers had been wrested from him, and the battle had left him hopeless and barely alive. My eyes scanned the mountains, seeking answers about what had happened to him. Perhaps I was about to find out. I took my first steps down a rough mountain trail, relieved now that I didn't have the horses with me, for the range stretched for many miles in each direction, and the way down was too treacherous, even for those with 4 hooves. Somewhere down there was my family, or what remained of it. My family was small, after all, unless I included Regan and Brennan. In that case, I supposed it was growing. Those poor children. Though Regan had been on the edge of becoming a young woman, I shouldn't have been calling them children, as one might call me a child as well. I found myself going down deep into the depths of the mountain range. In recent months, I'd spent a fair bit of time inside mountains, helping Kara's race of Lucents escape their own predator. While I knew that great beauty probably sang inside of the mountains I walked over, I had no desire to take a risk like that again. I wondered where exactly Connell's battle with Phelan had taken place. Part of me knew that there had been much light in the cave where he had protected the jellyfish keepers. He had felt like a total failure when Phelan had fight, wresting his power from him. That's a double right there that I need to fix. It was only my friendship that had brought Connell back around. But when I had reached the outer edges of the Shadow Mountains, I was able to do something new, possess another. Later, when Connell discovered this new ability of mine, it seemed something he was unwilling to forgive me for. As I walked, anger and shame fought for attention in my mind. It wasn't fair the way he had judged me. I wondered, was my new ability truly evil? Suddenly, I heard something overhead that both made my heart leap and terrified me, the distant cry of a monster, dragons. Immediately, I hid as best I could, but there were no caves here, only boulders. I watched them soar high above the earth, two of them, one green, one red. Were they the same ones that I had met in the Shadow Mountains? Were they the ones I'd saved, the ones I'd used to fight Phelan? There was no way to tell. But as I watched them flap their gigantic wings, spewing fire from their throats, I knew that trying to find out would be the death of me. So I sat there for several minutes, watching them play with each other as they soared through the sky, ducking out of the way of the other's flame, part of their game. How I wished I could have spoken with them without risking my life. You risk your life every day. It was true, I did, but I wasn't a total fool. Eventually, after 20 minutes of their playing, flew away and disappeared behind another taller mountain, not showing themselves again. I wondered if they had been able to sense my presence. Maybe, but if they had, they certainly didn't seem to care that they'd had a captive audience. I moved on, climbing down the mountainside as carefully as I could. The sun finally made it to the other side of the sky, and I found a place to rest. I had been becoming wobbly as I'd made my descent toward the valley. My legs shook as if I'd been paralyzed, barely able to stand. Finally, I had to stop. There were no caves in this strange mountain range, but I knew how to pull water from rock, something that took some time, but that resulted in the clearest drink one could find. If only there had been food. But with no other choice and a very empty belly, I settled into the night. I was amazed when several days later I made it to the other side. I was skin and bones. I could feel it even if I couldn't see it. My energy was lost, and though I was now high upon another precipice, I wondered with no small amount of desperation how I would get down the other side. I remembered the lack of food in the wild lands, and it brought despair to my mind. How could I fight whatever was going on in Eagleview if I was starving? I didn't have a choice. If I stayed where I was, I would surely die. So it was with this thought that I took the very last vestiges of energy I had and climbed down from that mountaintop, slowly my way to the other side. It didn't take as long to go down, though my balance was off. I made it a point to grip onto the rock beside me, unwilling to fall. After 2 days, I made it to the end, but I found myself unwilling to walk out into the open. From where I stood, I could see Eagleview in the distance, but the lands were barren, just as they'd been so many months before. My heart sank, realizing that I would have to continue, alone and starving. I made my way into the forest that surrounded the soaring mountains. This was a dangerous, I knew, for Varric made his home here, or made his haunt here. But I didn't see him, and it only took a few hours for me to make it to the other side of the trees. Then, trying to find whatever resolve I had left in my body, I walked out into the lonely wilderness of the wildlands. I was only a few steps out of the trees when I felt a sack going over my head and strong hands pushing me to the ground. I had no strength, and though I might have managed to curse my captor, I was too tired to care. I felt someone gripping onto my hands and feet, lifting me up and taking me back into the trees. What? I asked blearily. What do you want? We should ask you the same thing, an angry voice said. Why are you here? Did Zahn send you to find us? It was then that I realized I knew whose voice I was hearing. Kenneth? I asked. Is that you? Silence. Then footsteps and rough hands pulling the bag away from me. I turned and found one of my few friends staring at me in disbelief, though Kenneth had been little more than a pest in my previous life. He had always been looking for magic, liquid light or otherwise. I didn't hold ill will toward the boy who had tried to kiss me so many times in the dirty streets of Eagleview. On the contrary, I was quite relieved to see him. Someone had tied my hands behind my back, and, struggling, I flipped over. "Let me go," I said. "I mean you no harm, Kenneth. Don't you know me?" He took several steps backward, a face as if he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had, for my old life seemed like ages ago. "Bree," he finally said, taking a couple of steps toward me with what looked like fear in his eyes. "Yes," I said. "Can you untie me? I don't appreciate this. You know what I can do." At this, he smiled widely. For a moment, I thought that maybe things had changed for the worse. Could it be that Kenneth was working for Zahn? But no, he had asked me if Zahn had sent me. My fears soon abated. He walked behind me and easily released John's. Then, offering me his hands, he pulled me up and into a hug. "I thought you were dead," he said. "I saw what happened with Zahn when you left. Nobody thinks you made it through the wildlands." "What about my father?" I said. Why didn't he tell you the truth?" "Your father? I haven't seen your father for months." At this, my breath caught in my chest. Hadn't seen them? Wait, when was the last time? Are you telling me you didn't see the children either? He raised his eyes. Children? I leaned over, trying not to panic, trying to remember to breathe. I didn't know what all this meant, but if my father and the children had not been seen in Eagleview, I could only imagine the worst might have happened to them. I remembered the giant hawk that had nearly taken my father's life during our travels. I peeked out through the trees, certain that I would see a fiend out there waiting. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, confused. "I think I should bring you back," he said. "There are others, and they will have questions. So will I." "Do you have food?" I asked desperately. He just smiled, reaching out his hand for mine. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you everything." It didn't take long for us to reach his camp, and I was forcefully reminded of the children back in the Kaya forest, scrounging to get by. The guilt I felt for having abandoned them, for walking away from the many people I'd promised I would fight beside, flooded through me. There was people, adults and children, who sat off to one side near a roaring fire. "Aren't you afraid of being seen?" I asked, watching the smoke as it curled overhead. "We only set the fire to make our dinner. We will put it out soon enough." I perked up with the suggestion of food. I'm very hungry. Do you have enough to share?" He looked at me, concerned. "What has happened to you?" There were too many things to tell him. "First, I need to eat. It's been several days since I asked a bit of bread. I can offer you magic in return, but maybe not a kiss." "Of course you can eat," he said. "We don't have much, but it's not very often we have a sorceress in our midst." He led me over to a large pot that sat atop the fire. "Alan," he said, "can she have a bowl?" The man by the fire looked at me appraisingly, frowning. "We don't have much. This is Bree from Eagleview. She can help us, but we must help her first." He scowled as he ladled some stew to a bowl. Then he handed it to me. "It's hot," he said grumpily. This was difficult for me to resist, but burning my mouth would do me no good. So I stood there, letting the steam escape, waiting. "And what, pray tell, can a little waif like this help us with?" the man named Alan asked. "At least she won't eat much." Finally, after most of the steam had gone, I took the first bite. "I have magic," I said between bites. "What is this?" I asked. "Rabbit." I couldn't remember the last time I'd had rabbit, but I remembered very clearly the last time I'd seen one. Varric had nailed its body to a tree to scare us, to scare me. It had worked. I looked around the forest involuntarily, searching for danger, even though a group like this would bring a certain measure of safety. Now that I'm here, I couldn't deny my hunger, and as soon as it cooled, I began wolfing down the stew. Even though I'd had that small bit of light, it hadn't been anywhere near enough to keep me going. Finally, after scooping up the last bowl, I handed it back to the man. I had to try very hard not to ask for more. As I'd eaten, a small group of people gathered around, perhaps looking for their own dinner. Several of them crossed their arms, angry that I'd taken some of their food. I noted that several of these people looked starving themselves. "I'm sorry," I said to them. "I didn't mean to barge in and take your food. I've been traveling for weeks. Thank you for your generosity." There was a low grumble amongst the crowd as soon as I saw someone I recognized, someone I wasn't sure I would see again after listening to the story my grandmother had told. Brennan. He ran up to me and wrapped his arms around my middle. It was only when I pushed him away to look into his face that I saw he was crying. "What happened to you?" I asked. "Where is Regan and father?" He shook his head, seemingly unwilling to speak. "We haven't seen this kid so alert since we got here," Kenneth said. "You know him?" I turned to him. "I do, and I know his sister as well. Is she here?" "A sister? No, we can barely get him to speak at all." I leaned over again. "You're going to be okay," I lied. I had no idea what was really going on back in Eagleview, but I knew he needed to hear this if he was going to survive. All right, time to switch it up. And then find the right, which is here. Okay. Here we go. Open quote. "How did you get here?" Question mark. Close quote. I asked Brennan. Period. But he seemed unwilling to speak, comma, even to me, period. I looked over at Kenneth, period. Open quote. "Well," mark, close quote, new line. He shrugged, period, open quote. "He just showed up one day, period. We don't know where he came from or who he is, period. You say his name is Brennan, question mark, close quote. Brennan." Looked down at him again, comma, wiping away his tears with my hands, period, open quote. "That's right, comma, close quote," I said, period. I knelt down and looked him in the face, period. Open quote. "I need you to tell me what happened to the others, period. Did he take them, question mark, close quote, new line. Eyes grew wide, comma, and he nodded, period. New line. My stomach tightened at this news, comma, and I realized I probably shouldn't have eaten as much as I had, period. Weeks with little food, and my stomach could barely tolerate it, period. New line. Open quote. Question mark, close quote, I asked, period. New line. Open quote. It'll be the dungeons, comma, close quote, Kenneth said, period. Open quote. Anyone with ties to magic ended up getting rounded up and put down beneath the city, period. Close quote, new line, open quote. But why? Question mark. Surely they didn't all have magic, comma, themselves, question mark. Close quote, new line, open quote. Things have changed, period. Zahn insists on having total control over all magic in the city, period. It's much worse than when you left, period. Close quote, new line. When I had left 7 months, comma, magic had been outlawed then, comma, too, period. But the lawmen didn't persecute people so much, comma, as they eagerly forced magic out of unknown sorcerers, comma, and stole the capit from those who were brave enough to bring it into the market, period. New line. Something must have changed, period. Zahn must have changed, period. New line. I looked around at the many people sitting by the fire, comma, all of their attention on me, our conversation, period. New line, open quote. How did you get out? Question mark, close quote. I asked the crowd, period. No one spoke, comma, and everyone looked at Kenneth, period. New line, open quote. We got out before it was too bad, comma, close quote, he said, period. Open quote. I had to escape my own family, period. You know my father, semicolon. To say he's a rat is an understatement, period. I was very relieved when he didn't find you before you left the kingdom, period. New line, undo, close quote, new line. Open quote. There had been a bounty on my head for the days leading up to my final goodbye to Eagleview, period. It was 20 pieces of silver, comma, and they wanted me brought in alive, period. Check, period. New line. Open quote. I suppose he's been quite an informant, comma, close quote, I said, period. Open quote. Anyone else I should look out for? Question mark, close quote. New line. Kenneth and his easy smile seemed gone forever, period. This boy had been replaced by a man, comma, young. Intense now as he led this group of refugees, period. New line, open quote. Pretty much everyone, comma, close quote, he said, period. He looked around at the crowd. comma, at 4 people in particular, period, open quote. This is Graham, semicolon. He helped me in the beginning, comma, but he was injured on his way out of the city, period, close quote, new line. The man, Graham, pulled up his pant leg, and I was badly burned, period. New line, open quote. Zahn, question mark, close quote, new line, open quote. No, comma, close quote, Graham said, period, open quote. One of his minions, period, close quote, new line. So that's what they were calling them now, comma, his students, period, new line, open quote. This is Finley, comma, close quote, Kenneth went on, period. New line. This one didn't smile at all, semicolon. Instead, comma, she scowled at me as if I represented nothing more than danger to her, period. New line, open quote. She's not exactly very trusting, comma, close quote, he said. Period. Open quote. But she's useful in a bind, period. Close quote, new line. It was then that I realized she had been the one to tie my hands, period. Useful, comma, indeed, period, new line. And this, I'm looking at names. I actually have some names ready today, so. Open quote. And this is Kearney, comma, close quote. He said, period, open quote. He's the one who hunts for us, period. We'd all be dead without him, period, close quote. Him. To this man, comma, I nodded in thanks, period, open quote. The stew was amazing, period. You'll have to teach me how to ensnare rabbits, period. Close quote, new line. I'd tried this once before, comma, helped by the man, Malcolm, comma, but that had been a long time ago, comma, it seemed, period. New line. Finley stood up and approached me, period, open quote. I've heard about you, comma, close quote, she said, period, open quote. With you here, comma, surely, period, close quote, new line, open quote. And why is that, question mark, close quote, I asked, period, open quote. I would think you'd be relieved to have a sorceress on your team, period, close quote, new line. Kenneth shook his head, period, open quote. As the months went by, comma, Zahn figured out how to sense sorcery, period. True, comma, it only really worked when they were close by, comma. But for those who hid, comma, he had a most unpleasant ending, period, close quote, new line, open quote, like my father, question mark, and Regan, question mark, close quote. I looked down at Brennan, period. He looked back and forth between my face and the stew that still cooked atop the fire, period. New line, open quote, undo. Open quote. Are you hungry? Question mark, close quote. I looked up at Kenneth, period. New line, open quote. I'm sure he is, comma, close quote, he said, period. Open quote. But he doesn't eat much, period, close quote, new line. I remembered this from our trip through the Cap Wild Cap lands, comma, undo, semicolon. Brennan had been responsible for gathering plants for us to subsist on as we traveled through that death place, period. I wondered if he was doing the same thing now, comma, only not telling anyone, period. New line, open quote. Kearney, comma, close quote. Kenneth said, period, open quote. Can you get this boy, comma, Brennan, is it? Question mark. Close quote. He looked down at him, comma, and Brennan shrunk back, comma, holding my hand tightly, period. He slowly nodded, period. Open quote. Nice to meet you, comma, close quote. Period. I'd like it if you would eat, comma, especially since I know now that you're a friend of Breeze, period. Close quote. New line. Brennan looked out from behind my legs, comma. Then his hunger seemed to get the better of him, comma, and he sprinted over to the fire, period. The man tending the stove ladled him out a small serving, period. Brennan looked down at it as if it were the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, period. New line. Open quote. It's hot, comma, close quote, the man said, comma, echoing his command, undo, the command he'd given me several minutes before, period. New line. I can help with that, comma, close quote, I said, period. Open quote. I held out my hands for the bowl, comma, but Brennan looked at it protectively, period. Open quote. Brennan, comma, it's me, period. I can help you with that. Close quote. I promise I won't eat it, period, close quote. New line. Reluctantly, comma, he held out the bowl, period. I placed my hands around it and set my intention, comma, bringing cold to my fingers and bring it to the bowl of hot stew, period. A few moments later, comma, the steam abated, comma, and I handed it back to him, period. He looked at me in awe, comma, even though I knew he'd seen my magic before, period. New line. Maybe it's been a while, period. New line. Brennan, comma, not wanting to stand, comma. Brennan found a tree stump to sit upon, comma, and began wolfing the stew down, period. New line. I looked around at the many faces, period. Open quote. So you are all afraid of me, question mark. I can help you, comma, too, question mark, quote. A different man, comma, one whose name I didn't know, comma, opened his mouth to argue, period, open quote. The only thing you'll help us with is getting our hiding place discovered, comma, close quote, he said angrily, comma, staring at Kenneth, period, open quote. You need to get her out of here before someone discovers her. Finds us, period. Close quote, new line. Open quote. We need her, comma, close quote, Kenneth said. Period. Open quote. She's the only one who has magic, comma, and I'm willing to bet she can hide herself pretty well, period, close quote, new line. The man laughed, comma, a barking, comma, irritated sound, period, open quote. It doesn't matter if she can hide, comma, close quote, he said, period, open. She can't hide from him, period, close quote. Open quote. From Zahn, question mark, close quote, I asked, period. New line. There was another low rumble from the group, comma. And the sound wasn't good, period. In my favor, period. New line. I looked back up at Kenneth, period. Had he grown, question mark. Close. Undo. Open quote. I'll stay for the night, comma, close quote, I said, period. I turned back to the group, period. Open quote. I promise you I'll be on my way at first light, period, close quote, new line. Open quote. No, comma, close quote, Kenneth said, period. He gripped onto my arm, comma, turning me toward him, period. Open quote. I won't let you go back there. Period. You'll be found, and then he'll kill you. Period. You know that's what will happen. Period. Close quote. New line. Open quote. And you know that I can beat him, comma, close quote, I said, period. New line, open quote. Maybe just him, comma, but I doubt even your power is enough to stand against 15 or 20 sorcerers, period. Close quote, new line, open quote. I'm going home, comma, close quote, I said stubbornly, period. New line. A moment later, comma, I felt Brennan's hand in mine once more, period. I looked down, period, new line. Open quote. You can't leave me here, question mark, close quote. He said in the tiniest voice, period. New line, open quote. You know I can't take you, period. You'll be safer with these people, period. Close quote. I looked up at Kenneth, period, open quote. These people will protect you. Protect you, period, close quote. He shook his head, and new tears began to form in his eyes, period. New line, open quote. Kenneth, comma, tell him he'll be okay, period, close quote. I looked at him expectantly, period. But he just shook his own head, period. New line, open quote. No one is safe anywhere now, comma, close quote, he said, period. New line. I stared at him, comma, incredulous at his tone, period. Then, comma, I grabbed onto his arm and drew away from the crowd, comma, releasing Brennan's hand, period. New line, open quote. That kind of attitude will get you nowhere, comma, close quote, I said, period. Open quote. Don't you know, question mark. There has to be hope, comma, or you don't stand a chance, period, close quote, new line. The look in his eye told me that if I said more, comma, he might start crying, comma, too, period. New line, open quote. But then, comma, he shook his head a little, comma, seeming to come back to himself, comma, this new leader, period. New line, open quote. We haven't had hope for quite some time, comma, close quote, he said, period, open quote. But you're right, period, close quote, new line. He looked out at the faces now growing, haunted by the light from the fire, period. Dark. Period. Open quote. I will come with you. Period. Close quote. New line. I shook my head. Period. Open quote. That's crazy. Period. If what you're saying is true, comma, you'll be dead within an hour. Period. Close quote. New line. Open quote. And so will you. Period. Close quote. New line. Deny this danger, comma. But suddenly I felt protective over my old friend. Period. The friends I'd made since leaving Eagleview had been few and far between, comma, despite the fact that I had been able to gather them together against Torin, period. New line. I looked over at Brennan, comma, realizing that he was standing only a few feet away, comma, listening, period. New line, open quote. I will go, comma, too, comma, close quote, he said, period. He lifted his chin, comma, a gesture I'd seen from him many times, period. New line. I smiled sadly, period. Open quote. You'll need to stay, good. Close quote. New line. His face fell, comma, and he stepped backwards until he was almost atop the fire, period. New line. Kenneth caught my attention again with a squeeze of my hand. His hand, period. Open quote. You and I will go alone, period. We will leave early, period. Together, comma. Maybe we'll be able to get somewhere, period. Close quote. New line. Period. As excited as I was to see my family, comma, I knew that there was a distinct possibility that they were gone, period. Lost, period. No, comma, excitement wasn't the right emotion, period. I needed to steel myself for the very worst, period. I thought about the things that Torin did to people, comma, the way he tortured them, comma, period. I just hoped I wouldn't eat, period. New line. Kenneth showed me where to sleep, comma, and I wrapped my traveling cloak around me as the fire went out, period. As I stared up through the trees at the stars beyond, comma, I knew that sleep would elude me, period. Still, comma, I rested at least, period. New line. Eventually, comma, I must have fallen asleep, comma, for when I heard the twig snap this time, comma, it jostled me awake, period. New line. I looked around through the trees, comma, and I didn't find pursuers, semicolon. Instead, comma, I found Kenneth with one finger up to his lips, comma, indicating quiet, period. New line. I listened, period. Just on the outskirts of the trees were hoofbeats, unmistakable, period. Men spoke just out of earshot, comma, but not loudly enough for me to make out their words, period. New line. I heard nothing but jumbled thoughts and the snorting sounds of the horses as they walked by, period. Finally, comma, after searching the woods, comma, I could hear them moving away, period. New line. I turned to Kenneth and whispered, comma, open quote, they didn't, period. How come, period. Undo, question mark, close quote. He was watching me carefully, comma, then turned to look further through the trees, period. He stood up and walked quietly away, period, comma, beckoning me to join him, period, open quote. The lawmen don't have magic of their own, comma, close quote, he said, period, open quote. It's only when they come with one of Zahn's pupils that the danger is so bad, period. Terrible, period. Great, period, close quote, new line. I looked out through the thinning trees into the dark grassland that stretched between here and the Cap Wild Cap lands, period. I could see the men, comma, 6 of them on horses, comma, as they made their way away from us, comma, patrolling the edges of the forest, period. New line, open quote. Do they do this every night? Question mark, close quote, I asked, period. New line. Open quote. Not every night, period. Close quote. I think we got lucky, period, close quote, new line. We've lost a few as the months have passed by, period. But none of them have spoken a word about where we are, period, close quote, new line, open quote. How do you know? Question mark, close quote, new line, open quote. They haven't found us, comma, now have they? Comma, close quote, new line. Period, close quote, new line. I shrugged, period, open quote. I guess not, period, close quote, new line. I turned and went back to where my things lay on the forest floor, period. I picked up my pack and secured it around me, period. New line, open quote. I think we should get moving, comma, close quote, I said, period. Open quote. Before he wakes up, period, close quote. I pointed to where Brennan had fallen asleep, semicolon. He had crawled up next to me, comma. And I felt terrible guilt at turning away from him, period. New line. But this was no war for children, period. New line. Somewhere in the back of my mind, an image of Iona and the children of the who'd fought their entire lives, comma, came to me, period. I wondered what kind of life Brennan might have had if he'd come along with me on that journey, period. New line. Those children are gone, period. They're Torrens now, period. New line. There. I understood this, comma, knew it was true, comma. But I also knew that Brennan had skills more than any other child I'd met, period. He had kept us alive, comma, after all, period. New line. I turned back to Brennan. Kenneth, period. Open quote. We should go now, period. Close quote, new line. Open quote. Are you sure? Question mark. The boy might not be able to handle disappearing, period. Close quote, new line. I nodded, period, open quote. Can you be ready in 5 minutes? Question mark, close quote, new line. Open quote. I can be ready in 3, period, close quote. New line. He walked away from me, comma, stopping briefly next to the place beside Brennan, and silently grabbing his own cloak and traveling pack, period. New line. Ready, comma. He walked up and stood beside me, period. New line, open quote. Do you know the way? Question mark, close quote, I asked, period. Quote. I took a different direction last time, period. I don't know if it's the fastest, period, close quote, new line. Open quote. Don't you get it? Question mark, close quote, he asked, period. Open quote. This isn't about speed, period. It's about survival, period, close quote. He was right, period. Comma. But I was desperate to discover what had happened to my family, comma. And that called for speed, period. New line, open quote. Fine then, period. Show me how to survive, comma. And let's eat those we can, period, close quote. All right, that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. I will be back tomorrow, which is Wednesday, for episode 8. And if you have any questions, go ahead and email me, Jen, Jen, at thehumanauthor.com. Thanks for joining me. Have a good day.